of the Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And in making this acknowledgement, we commit to decolonizing practices and land repatriation. So we're very excited to have all of you with us here today from all over the world and from all different sort of time zones. This webinar is the first in a series of webinars that's dedicated to highlighting issues related to mental health, disability rights, and social justice. And the series is sponsored by organizations that are partners with the project that I mentioned. And that project is funded through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and it's called Realizing Human Rights and Social Justice in Mental Health. And so the sponsors on this event are TCI-Global, which is an organization dedicated to the realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms for people with psychosocial disabilities. The Empowerment Council, which is a patient advocacy organization that works to empower the collective voices of service user and mental health and substance use systems, which independently operates in a psychiatric hospital in Toronto, Canada. And the Canadian Centre for Disability Studies Incorporated, which operates as Eviance, which is a community-based hub of knowledge on cross-disability issues, also located in Canada. So our webinar today brings together activists from the Global South and the Global North together in an intergenerational discussion about MAD activism, movements of persons with psychosocial disability, and disability rights across time. And we're going to begin the session with two speakers who are going to showcase the historical activism of psychiatric survivors, MAD peoples, people with psychosocial disabilities. And then following this, Olivia Boonstra, who's from Eviance, is going to lead a panel of 4 participants who will bring this history into conversation with contemporary activism led by the next generation. You have bios of all the speakers, so I'm going to just very briefly introduce the first 2 speakers, and then I'm going to hand things over briefly to Richa, who's going to address a few sort of housekeeping guidelines for the session. So the 2 speakers for this morning are Bhargavi Davar, and she is the originator of Bapu Trust, which was the first survivor-led organization in India, and she convened TCI-Global in 2013. Which is the organization that I mentioned earlier that is led by people with psychosocial disability, people who identify as neurodiverse. Lucy Costa, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the Empowerment Council, which is a user rights-based organization. She's worked for many years as an activist and an advocate promoting the rights of mental health service user survivors, as well as encouraging critical analysis about service user inclusion in the mental health sector. So I'm going to turn things over to Risha for a moment, just to give you some housekeeping guidelines about kind of how we'll manage questions and how the session will run. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're in the world today. Thank you so much for making the time to attend this session. I am Richa. I am the Research and Advocacy Officer with Transforming Communities for Inclusion, TCI-Global. And before we begin with the speakers, I'll take you through some of the housekeeping guidelines we have for this session. This webinar is being recorded so that participants who are unable to attend it live due to differences in time zones will be able to access the recording later. We request all the speakers to please speak slowly. This is to ensure that we are being considerate to all the support persons as well as our participants. Speaking slowly would help the international sign interpreters, captioners, and translators to comfortably meet the flow of the presentations. We will also request the support persons to flag us to slow down in case we are moving too fast. For the speakers again, we request you to kindly keep your microphone and camera off while you're not speaking. You can turn on your video and microphone when you're invited to speak on the panel. For the participants, we are providing international sign interpretation and closed captions for this session. To have access to the closed captions, please click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We also have Spanish translators for the session. To access the Spanish translation channel, please click on the globe on the bottom of your screen and select Spanish as the language. During the event, if you have any questions for the panelists, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box, which can be accessed at the bottom of your screen. The panelists can respond to the questions directly in the chat box or take them up at the end of the session. And as requested in the question and answer panel box right now, we are keeping the chat open for any interactions or comments that you wish to make. We will also have a short 5 minutes break in between both the sessions. With that, I welcome both the speakers, Bhargavi and Lucy, to please start their session. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be on this session and to be sharing this space with Lucy Costa, whose work I have admired over the years. It's great to be here with Evians, Susan, Marina, and several others with whom we've had long exchanging conversations to make these webinars happen. We hope that it will be useful for us. Lucy, would you like to start off the conversation and then I can come in a bit?
Sure. I mean, and I'm happy to have a dialogical conversation, Bhargavi, because we've also done this activist work for so long together. So good morning, good afternoon to everybody as well. I'm also very happy to be here. And my name is Lucy Costa, and I use the pronouns she and her. I also wanted to thank everybody for pulling this project together. It's a big project, and I want to also thank the people working on translation and sign language. I guess I want to take a moment to also thank everybody in the audience, because I know there's also people who've worked for many years doing human rights and social justice work, and that it's precisely because of the way in which we have for many years organized dialogues, circles of support, conversations, demonstrations, that we have, despite governments of repression and suppression, have remained an inextinguishable and unyielding group of folk. And so as such, I want to honor that we're still here and we're still fighting across the globe, and that I'm really hopeful and supportive of the work of the future generations to come to carry on with this work. Did you want me to keep going, Bhargavi?
Yes, Lucy, I think that would be great, so that you have an uninterrupted narrative to share. I know these aspects of personal journeys and collectivist histories are quite a reflective journey. I experienced that myself when I was remembering, the history of my activism in the country and in the Asia Pacific. So I would be very happy to let you lead on with your recall, and I will come in a bit later. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bhargavi. So I guess when we were thinking about how we would start the conversation for this webinar and this project, which centrally is taking up the question of human rights, but also more specifically coercion across different sites, so Canada, Kenya, and Australia. We wanted to sort of take this on by not revisiting research and literature that already exists that speaks about coercion in the system, because we know that we don't need to we don't need to propagate more research that talks about coercion when we already know it exists, but to try to figure out, like, how do we move forward and what is the work that needs to be done. And I think the reason that Garvey and I are starting this session today, because there are three webinars, this is the first of the three, is that we wanted to situate the work in this long-standing history of work that's already been going on for many years. And when I was reflecting on what to say to this morning, the thing that came to my mind that I sort of have been thinking about are the psychiatric, is the erasure of our work and histories, and the psychiatric politics of memory, and how that gets deployed in terms of, like, how history gets told, what gets remembered, what gets recorded, and how is the story of psychiatric medicine explained. I also was thinking about this term that came up in another seminar I did a while ago, which has to do with the inclusion industrial complex. And by an inclusion industrial complex, I mean the way in which the politics of inclusion have proliferated, but have become something that isn't about inclusion at all, even though it's using the language of inclusion and some practices of inclusion. And finally, I was thinking about the very elusive access to justice, to legal justice, and the way in which different kinds of conversations about justice are interfacing with each other. For service users and survivors, and also for other people who are involved in sectoral work in the mental health system. So when I start by talking about erasure, I think that in my experience, in my work, it's very actually difficult to talk about the work that's already happened and have it included in education, in curriculum, and pedagogy, because there's quite a bit of resistance to acknowledging and incorporating that knowledge, that oral history, that expertise. And there's resistance because it's a difficult history, because it's a history of violence. It speaks about violence and abuse and neglect that was done under the guise of treatment. And the way that that's spoken about, responded to, is still in motion, and we haven't resolved that. We haven't come to a place where those past incidents, violence, abuses have been addressed and remedied. But it's also, erasure is also happening in the way the history is told, and in the way in which words are being taken up. So words that we would use historically to name some of the things that happened to service users and survivors have now been co-opted. So I'm thinking about words like words like revolution, participation, and even mad identity in and of itself gets co-opted in particular kinds of ways in the mental health system. So patient narratives, like research, is still very much governed by psychiatric interpretation. And words like engagement, equity, co-production continue to propagate these fantasies that somehow services are actually changing with the participation of service users. When in fact, I think what's happening is that there's been a focus on inclusion to the detriment of collective organizing and work. So that we tend to focus on singular narratives and not the opportunity to build together collective work with each other. And this has implications, of course, for how we share information with each other, how people learn to navigate the system, etc. So despite all our intentions to have the phrase "nothing about us without us," we're in a strange predicament now where that phrase no longer applies because people are being included. And what are the implications of that? What are the implications of that inclusion? And I think I would caution around us, thinking about this uh, in a binary way, like that there's those who are working uh, in the system and those are working out of the system. Because again, to me, this is very complex. The workforce is complex, and there's definitely people who have lived experience or experience of mental health systems and coercion that are part of the workforce. There are also other identity groups doing activist work, and I'm thinking a lot about trans activism and the way the trans activism is now shaping what's happening in psychiatric medicine. I'm thinking about critical race theory and how critical race theory is very much shaping what's happening in psychiatric medicine. So to not look at the way these things are intersecting with the politics of inclusion, I think would be a mistake. Also talked about the challenges of justice and tensions between different kinds of justice. So access to justice, access to law, access to lawyers, access to a process where people feel like they have procedural justice. That meaning, so it's not just access to law and processes where people can have wrongs righted, but it's also the way in which those exchanges happen. Do people feel like they actually have voice in those legal processes? Do they feel like they're being treated with dignity and respect? Do they feel like they're getting someone who is neutral and literally listening to them, not being informed by best interest? And do they trust the motives of people that are assisting in whatever procedural justice? And whether that's service users or legal counsel, what is the experience of people trying to access justice? I want to also juxtapose this with other tensions that are happening in the workforce. For example, with paradigms such as just culture. Just culture is a particular paradigm that looks at how to create organizational spaces that are non-punitive for staff, and that focuses on accountability within organizations. For example, lots of times in hospitals, there are medical errors. This is just part of what happens. So instead of becoming punitive and not creating a just culture where people feel like they can come forward and talk about mistakes that they've made, just culture focuses on establishing and responding to employee behavior in a fair and just manner, so that quality of care improves and choices improve, etc. So, of course, this is also complex because in these particular workforces, which again are very diverse and are also people who, the workforce in the mental health sector is very much populated with people who have had experiences in the psychiatric system as well. So how do you manage these particular tensions that have to do with justice? And I think that to me, this is a challenging thing because you don't want to have punitive employee spaces, but at the same time, you want to be able to obviously address and foster the violations and abuse that happens in particular kinds of systems, whether that's institutions or whether that's in places that don't seem like they're violent, like community mental health care, which has actually less oversight to their practices. I still think people have a hard time, even within cultures that are quote unquote promoting just culture. And because I still get, for example, staff calling me talking about different things that they're experiencing in healthcare system that they can't go to their union about, that they can't go to like fellow staff folk about. So within this context, I think that these are some of the challenges that we have going forward, thinking about, you know, how to change with the politics of erasure when we're not allowed to speak about things that have happened in the past. We're not allowed to tell the stories in the way that we've been able to historically tell them. We don't have the resources to preserve archival history. How do you deal with the politics of inclusion now that we're actually all informing the system? I think it's a false binary, as I said, to assume that, you know, that there's like an external group doing work and not an internal group doing work within various kinds of systems. And then how do you contend with these different complex tensions of access to justice, especially in a world where we're now dealing with pre and post-pandemic challenges and barriers. We're dealing with the upcoming challenges of climate change, which will definitely affect how we talk about and how psychiatric medicine is informed, not to mention the 89 million people who have been displaced globally by war, violence, and poverty. So I better stop there to give you a chance, McGarvey.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And thank you for bringing the thematic around access to justice quite frontally in a discourse about mental health and mental health care systems. This fact in itself is astonishing that, you know, when you talk about the mental health care system, you willy-nilly end up talking about access to justice. This is a peculiarity of the mental health care system. You know, I've been a diabetic for a long time, but when I talk about my diabetic condition, I don't automatically jump to the penal system or the access to justice system. I just find a good doctor and get myself treated. And this peculiarity has really driven my work and the organizations that I've been associated with since a long time. Another context for me for this conversation, which I think is really important, especially from an intergenerational point of view, the feminist movement, the indigenous peoples movement, and other movements here in India on development and inclusion in development, they are intergenerational conversations. And these conversations do not happen so often in the MAD movement. And so I think this is really an important place for us to bring up some of those, you know, where are you and where are, I know that when we were discussing what we should cover in our dialogue here, we did talk about, you know, this particular being in the past and being in the here and now. Both of these are important to build the story, to build the narrative about our movements. There's also this conversation that we discussed in the making of this particular concept for 3 webinars, the conversations between the Global North and the Global South movement for the liberation of different identities. We have mad persons in our region, we have persons of unsound mind, we have neurodiverse persons, users and survivors of psychiatry, persons occupying intersecting identities along with disability identities, persons with psychosocial disabilities, all of that. So the good thing about having these many instead of mentally ill person, patient, schizophrenic, bipolar, and so on, is that we get to choose which part of this identity we wish to occupy. And my response to that, which has really been contributed by a number of leaders, actors, and peers and friends, it's a bit personal, while recalling that the personal provides a leverage for the political. So if I may, Lucy, I have like a story to tell which builds up the past and the present for me in my experience. I identified myself as an adult survivor of childhood exposure to colonial mental asylums in India. It took me about 5 decades to arrive at this diagnosis. It's quite a mouthful, and I'm searching for an acronym for this diagnosis. It's not in the DSM. Born in the 60s, I was a child witness to the horrors of mental asylum-dom in a country where the empire had just retreated and left behind such terrible penal laws for different types of human beings and all that vast custodial infrastructure which exists till today. Indian asylums, like elsewhere in post-colonial worlds, were built around the 1850s for a number of designated people: lunatics, idiots, lepers, fakirs, mendicants, vagrants, paupers, indigenous tribes perceived as criminal, and of course, those accused of a crime. And these were all in the same lot. To better incarcerate this diversity of peoples and deprive them of their liberty, there were also provisions and practices of trans-institutionalization, which continues till today. In TCI, Transforming Communities for Inclusion, we say that our movement is 8 decades long and at least as long as psychiatry. TCI itself is about 10 years old, and we only recently registered as a global organization. However, it is built on the histories of thousands of people who died as martyrs, harmed by a system that's supposed to care. Today, we remember and honor these martyrs, our leaders, past, present, and emerging, and all those who are not afraid to look at the system in the eye and speak truth to power. Without knowing that I was joining anything like a movement or psych resistance, I started traveling, often without any resources, in the 1980s. I could say that officially, this was the time I joined our movement. By this time, I had gathered some knowledge about anti-psychiatry through reading books and papers somehow resourced. Kate Millett, Albert Camus on the freedom to choose suicide, Sylvia Plath, Bregan, Thomas Saz, Andrew Scull, so on and so on. During my travels, I came across treasures and treats. Meeting Leonard Ray Frank, who gave his life protesting electroshock, was a high point. And discovering the treasure, Madness Network News, meeting David Oakes, Dan Fisher, Judy Chamberlain, so on and so on. Mary O'Hagan, Sylvia Caras, those are fond memories. During the early years of the CRPD, I met other leaders: Chris Hansen, Iris Helling, David Webb, Mari Yamamoto, Oyong Kwon, Tina Minkowitz, Gabor Gombosch, and so many others. By the mid-90s, I had met fellow mad people, lunatics, and persons of unsound mind in India, so designated by competent courts, but mostly women. We elevated a fragile idea to a collectively experienced factual claim that women's madness was manufactured by a neo-colonial, patriarchal, and casteist industry. And further, that there were many curious elements in that business which were quite baseless. Paradoxically, it is an industry that clamors all the time for an evidence base. For example, till date, there is no evidence for the physiological or anatomical pathways for a diagnosis of mental disorder, which is expected for any decent manifestation of a disease. Whereas there is ample evidence from various development initiatives, reviews, and studies that there is food scarcity, starvation, poverty, jobs are scarce, children face abuse, domestic violence is still widely prevalent, and so on, causing indeterminate levels of stresses and tensions to people, children, families, and populations. In the mid-90s in India, I and some of my peers organized the first ever national gathering of women's organizations, critically looking at madness, insanity, and medical disorders. Women chose the identity of mad women over patients or mentally ill people. We condemned forced treatment way back in the 1990s. I want to share here that recently, it's not so recent actually, during Corona times, we identified an organization. I hope Sarah has joined us today. And PSA, Psychiatric Survivors Association from Fiji, we discovered to be one of the oldest other than the Bapu Trust, and another organization in Hong Kong, which has a survivor history and survivor leadership. So we were not alone here, but it felt so alone at this time. By the early 2000s, there was a buzz about the conventional rights of persons with disabilities, but sadly, no movement of mad persons in India to receive this. A few stragglers like me tried to find our space in the cross-disability dynamic where we were quite invisible and inaudible. Can you imagine, for a whole large country like India, one of the most populated countries of the world, there were no users and survivors of psychiatry, mad people, etc., and certainly no mad studies. But to be honest, there were very few institutions, only those that were left by the colonizers, and the industry was not yet privatized as it is now. The more entrepreneurial psychiatrists mostly migrated to other countries, particularly the UK. For decades between the 1960s and the 80s, the professionals and policymakers kept complaining that there were no psychiatrists and there were no beds. Maybe a good thing. By the late 70s, the World Health Organization was promoting the idea, backed by guides and resources, that countries which did not have a mental health law had poor mental health infrastructure, and they need to invest in mental health lawmaking. In India, therefore, there was a whole law, Lunacy Act, and about 150 or more legal incapacity provisions that disqualified our personhood. These legal frameworks were waiting to be harvested, and a new political economy to surface and sponge living off people's lives. A new law was made and notified in 1987, the Mental Health Act, a coercive law. By the time this law was notified, I was reeling with the acute trauma of my diagnosis as an adult survivor of childhood psychiatric, so on and so forth. Is this all right for you, Lucy? Am I carrying on too much? Would you like me to be shorter, or is there something specific that that you would like to recall my attention to?
I mean, it's like it's amazing to hear, and it's reminding me of all the amazing people that I have met along the way myself, and I now feel like I should have named all the amazing people that have actually helped save my life, because certainly psychiatric medicine did not save my life. So I relate a lot to to the importance of telling that story and finding that community and that collective way of making meaning. And I think specifically, like, these are the kinds of histories that are being erased. And it's also a generation of people that will never get remedy for the abuses that they've experienced. I don't know with legal recourse. Like in the global north, sometimes there's opportunities for people to do class actions where they collectively combine to address a systemic issue that's happened. And this can be one powerful way to seek remedy for terrible, like a terrible history of violence that had happened. And we haven't had, like, I think a couple of people have attempted to talk about how to remedy the historical wrongs that have happened. And I don't know what your thoughts are that on Bhargavi, because I feel very conscious that there's a whole generation of people that will never have their stories see the light of day as part of a larger collective group that experienced trauma.
Yeah. Yes, thank you so much, Lucy, for that. I think that Slowly, at least in the documents which are coming out from the United Nations, including the latest one, this is the guidelines on deinstitutionalization. It was as if the whole world looked at what's happening inside of these institutions during Corona pandemic times. And the CRPD committee was shocked by what they saw, and they initiated a process and a collection of organizations called GCDI. This is the Global Coalition for Deinstitutionalization. It includes a number of organizations. We supported the committee in bringing out this. And one of the top topics here is reparations. And if you notice, I started out by honoring the martyrs and leaders of our movement, past, present, and emerging. And I say this as TCI, but I hope that various governments would start to look at the reparations issue and be guided by the deinstitutionalization guidelines. And I believe that there is a lot of work for our movements to do together here, because of the idea that we don't see the mental health law as a historical baggage that all governments are carrying. We are seeing the mental health law as a care law. It's full of contradictions. There is no evidence whatsoever, and nor do we need the evidence when we know that testimonies after testimonies exist to attest and be witness to the horrors of institutionalization. We don't need any further evidence. But there is a kind of filter which continues to propagate the idea. And I really forward the work by the World Health Organization on this. And we should be cautious about guidances issued by the WHO. To share an example, the Global South, and that was also my enlightenment and redemption and my leveraging an identity of a person with a psychosocial disability rather than use a survivor. In many parts of the Global South, mental health laws did not exist. And slowly with influence by global agencies, the mental health laws started showing up. Along with mental health law, the law changes public consciousness. And when the laws came in, it changed the views about persons who were going through personal crisis or personal difficulties, distress, and psychosocial issues. Today, where there are new mental health laws, institutions are growing in numbers. Some of the worst institutionalization practices happens in the Asian region today. This was not the case 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when in many parts of the Asia-Pacific terrain, there were no mental health laws and therefore very few institutions. Of course, mental health services are needed. But unfortunately, people like us who have gone through lived experiences are forced to design and talk about ethical ways of providing services. This should be the job of professionals who are more concerned about holding us custody and under guardianship arrangements. As a world community of people occupying multiple identity positions, we should contest these laws. Still today, there are countries which have placed reservations on Article 12 and therefore deny us our personhood. But somewhere this is masked for some reasons, for historical reasons. And I know that we will have another webinar on this, so I will not preempt those conversations. But it's really important that we see the mental health legislations and the mental health system for what it is, as perpetrators of violence, and start seeking reparations. There must be service providers who commit to zero coercion while treating people with mental health issues. People should listen and center the voice of persons with psychosocial disabilities. So these are expectations, but the system has been unrelenting. The care system has been unrelenting. So hope that will change. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, Lucy Bagavu. Any final comments or thoughts you wanted to share?
Well, yeah, I mean, for me, the CRPD is the decolonizing tool. It is a decolonizing tool because it helps us to enter our world and our narratives through the inclusion perspective. When you enter the door through, the mental health perspective, we end up willy-nilly having to choose a position. Are we abolitionists or are we reformists? It is not, I mean, this is not a useful debate. Are you an abolitionist or are you? Of course, we are abolitionists. We don't want those institutions. Are we reformists? Of course, we are reformists because we want better services, which respects us, gives us autonomy and dignity within the care system, and therefore that's why inclusion is something that we deeply value, and we bring this value to all our advocacy. And so, yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity, Marina. Yeah.
Lucy, I don't know if you had any.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, I really like I really like that you challenged that whole duality of like abolition and reformist, because I agree. Of course, we want to abolish like all the terrible practices that are in existence. But we need to continue to find ways to care for people, because I've had lots of experiences where I think we also need to look at the fantasy that service users and the survivor community will all take care of each other, and there's no violence within the service user survivor community, and that there's no tensions there. That's a panel for another discussion, because racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia exists within the service user survivor community, and those two are violences that we need to look at. I just want to say finally about the CRPD that, and we've talked a little bit about this, but we also have different experiences of the arms of the CRPD, and I'll just give an example. Because we had someone come from the convention to Canada. And I think the process of how those dialogues happens needs to be deeper, because my experience was someone came from the CRPD, wanted to find out what was happening in institutions, came in for like a short while, visited psych units with the assumption that if you walk onto a psychiatric unit, you're going to see what you need to see in order to make an assessment. And I think that what goes on in psychiatric hospitals is very complex, and much of it is embedded in the structural documents and the way people socially relate to each other. So through the policies, through the practices, and through the hidden curriculum that is not always going to be visible to someone who comes in for a quick visit from the UN to make sense of it. And this is something that I've been thinking about, like writing to the CRPD about, to sort of have a deeper or more robust conversation about how these things intersect globally.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Lucy and Bhargavi, for these really powerful and insightful talks. I'm just thinking of some of the, just to pull together a couple of the threads before we take a short break. I really appreciate, Lucy, your comments about inclusion, sort of this inclusion industrial complex, and so particularly the comment about how so much of the focus has been on inclusion in the at least in the global North context, rather than on collective organizing. And so I think that's a piece that I'm really going to take away from your talk, as well as your conversation about justice and just culture. Really, really important concepts. But Garvey, I was thinking that, one of the things that you brought to bear, and both of you did, I think, is, sort of the acknowledgement of the long histories and the many different social movements and activists who have come before us and who have, laid the groundwork for these conversations and discussions. And I particularly appreciated your pointing to the sort of colonial histories. We were talking about it in the Indian context, but of course it's relevant in many parts of the world, and the legacy of those, penal laws and institutions, and how that has shaped, the way in which law has unfolded. And then finally, just one other point that you made that really struck me was the ways in which mental health law has come to be seen as a care law, rather than seeing it for what it is, which is this incredibly, oppressive kind of vehicle to deny personhood. So, and of course, there were many other wonderful insights, and the chat is of course blowing up with all sorts of comments. And I wanted to remind people, please feel free to use the chat. We apologize that there was a little bit of spam in there at one point, so apologies for that. And that person has been removed from the chat. If you have questions, please put them in the question and answer, and we will have a chance to get to them. We are going to allow people to take sort of a 5-minute stretch break, and then we'll come back for the panel, and then after the we'll get into the question and answers. So if you've got specific questions, throw them up in the Q&A, and please keep the chat going. Thanks, and we'll see you in 5 minutes. Hello, everyone. People slowly probably coming back from their little stretch break. Great. Okay, well, we wanted to begin the second half of the session, and the person that's going to be hosting that is Olivia Boonstra. So Olivia is the Senior Research Officer and Knowledge Mobilization Coordinator from Eviance. So I'm going to turn things over to her, and she's going to introduce the panel and begin the second part of the session. So go ahead, Olivia.
Thank you so much, Marina. And hello, everyone. Welcome back from the break. Thank you again for being here. I want to thank Marina again and Richa for really helpful context and the introduction at the beginning to really set the space that we're kind of able to virtually share today. I want to thank also Bhargavi and Lucy for a really interesting discussion and for all the knowledge they've shared today. I'm really excited to see how it's going to impact our panel discussion here as well. So as Marina noted, the overall goal of this webinar is to further a Global South and Global North intergenerational dialogue on MAD activism and psychosocial disability movements around the world and across time. So I'll thank Bhargavi and Lucy again, not just for the knowledge they've shared, but also for their continued work and activism in this area. I'm really grateful for this opportunity for all of us to learn about the history of this movement and also to now share some current work being done and some goals and hopes for the future. So our panelists today will be responding to questions based on three broad areas of focus that were really brought up in discussions with all the partners. So the first theme that we will explore today is identity and how people choose to identify within these movements, followed by psychiatry and biomedicalism as a colonial tool, and finally, movement building and planning for the future. So we'll be having a dialogue on these themes, and if you have any thoughts or questions that you want to bring to the panelists, please put it in the Q&A chat function, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. So now I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists for today. First, we have Fadi Shenouda. So Dr. Shenouda is a critical disability studies scholar who draws on feminist new materialism to examine disabled and MAD students' experiences in higher education. His scholarly contributions lie at the theoretical and pedagogical intersections of disability, MAD, and FAD studies. We also have with us Liz Umbati. Liz Umbati is a passionate disability rights advocate and trained journalist based in Kenya. Liz identifies as a woman with a psychosocial disability, and her lived experience informs her years-long advocacy in disability inclusive development. Liz and her colleagues have also recently started a peer-led initiative in Kenya called Championing for Inclusive Communities. We also have Chloe Rourke. Chloe Rourke is a second-year law student at McGill University and recently completed a human rights internship at the Council for Canadians with Disabilities. Chloe completed a Bachelor of Arts and Science in Cognitive Science at McGill and was a strong advocate for improving wellness services and accommodations for students with disabilities, in particular, students with mental health disabilities. And unfortunately, Sarah Osborne was not able to attend today, so we'll just be working with our three panelists. And with that, I think we can begin. So I'll start with our first area of interest, which is identity. And our first question for our panelists is, what does it mean to you to identify as a person with a psychosocial disability or a user and survivor or MAD persons or any other identity you may have chosen for yourself? Would you please mind sharing a little?
Hi, Olivia. Hi, everyone. So I'll go and I'll talk about identity for me as Elizabeth Umbati. And I think the journey, so I will really share my own personal experience, until the point that I reach where I self-identify as a woman with a psychosocial disability. And I think it started, way back when I was younger, and going through mental distress experiences that then I couldn't put a name to, and really facing difficulties in school, at the workplace, because I used to experience a lot of fear that I couldn't exactly put a name to that, until a point that a mental health diagnosis was made. And at some point, I was on medication, but then I still realized that the distress wasn't entirely going away. And for me, the light bulb moment, came when I was introduced to the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, where then I'm able to link that the fact that I experience mental distress should not be a reason that I don't participate. For example, because I used to have difficulties at work, keeping jobs was really quite difficult. And I remember a point that my colleague, and I really have to acknowledge the role that peers before me, I would mention, a peer called Michael Njenga, a lady called Susan Keter, Kanye Gikonyo, the persons that introduced us to users and survivors of psychiatry in Kenya, where many of us then started doing advocacy, for our advancement as rights for persons with psychosocial disabilities. So I remember this very particular moment when my friend asked me, Liz, don't you keep jobs because you have a mental health impairment, or it's because of barriers that exist? Is it because you're not receiving the necessary support that you should be able to receive? And for me, then I started viewing these experiences that actually, maybe if I received support, maybe I would be able to keep jobs. And it was very, very useful for me, because what used to happen is have peer support groups. So we would meet peers, colleagues who are different than, psychiatric labels, and we would meet every month, offering each other psychosocial support, which was so useful for some of us. Who continued on with this identity or with this advocacy, until the point where then I stopped really identifying as someone with a mental health condition. And I thought it was really political, because then I chose to identify as a person with a psychosocial disability, also acknowledging the work that had gone into the CRPD by our community, through the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry. So it was very intentional for me to identify as one with disability, and be able to claim benefits within disability law, information that wasn't offered to me back when I was specifically within the mental health system. And so for me, then, I think it's been really a learning journey, but also an appreciation journey, that without knowledge, sometimes knowledge is there, the CRPD is there, maybe not many of us who would identify as users, survivors of psychiatry or with psychosocial disabilities have no awareness. So sometimes I feel that once there's that awareness, and I can have a choice to identify. So that is why now I'm very intentional, and in everything I do, I start by saying that I'm Elizabeth and I identify as a woman with a psychosocial disability. So thank you. I hope that sort of answers that question.
That was really great. Thank you so much. Just a reminder to everyone, just to talk a little slow if you can, just so that the interpreters can catch everything. Fadi or Chloe, do you have anything you want to add to this question?
I can go. I think what it means to me is that I belong to a community. I belong to a network. I belong to a group that acknowledges past acts of violence to individuals who have body minds like ours. And that means I also have a place to go to when I need support, when I need care, when I need to generate resistance against whatever it might be, whether that's to actually go ahead and do some forms of collective activism, or if I need, or if I need support to accomplish a task, right, or to do any sort of like interpersonal thing. And so for me, identifying as a person with a disability before was always just about access to resources and access to accommodations. But as I've gotten older, it's now all about sort of the community I belong to. And that's been sort of a very rich and nourishing part of my life. Yeah.
Amazing. Chloe, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was so many great points that were already brought up. I think for me personally, I struggle with kind of identifying in any one particular way, in the sense that, you know, the label of like a psychosocial disability, something I've only recently, that term is only something I've recently learned about. I generally kind of use more language of mental health in general. And, you know, I don't like to identify too strongly with any kind of like medical or psychiatric label. But certainly my life and experiences over the last decade or so have been shaped by my involvement with the mental health community, my experiences, both requiring support, having to seek accommodation for myself, but also advocating for that support and accommodations to be available to other people. So it's been, you know, such an important presence in my life, but I struggle with putting a specific word or label to, you know, the experience of mental health, which I think is really universal. People just experience it and struggle with it in different ways at different times, you know, in part depending on what's going on in their life. So yeah, I guess know 100% how to answer that question, but I really agree with what's been said about, you know, recognizing the barriers and also the kind of community support and peer support networks, and what a powerful impact they can have.
Yeah, kind of going off of that as well. You know, in terms of identity and being able to identify however you feel comfortable, do you think that that is like a strength in our movement? And do you think that that could be leveraged in policy and practice? Like, how do you see multiple identities as being, you know, harnessable in this movement? Maybe Liz, you want to start?
And I refer back, I think, to what Bagavi talked about choice. You know, that that I have a choice on how I wish to identify, you know. And for me, I think what is even more important for me is when I reference the CRPD, when I reference the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the fact then that we are talking about rights, you know, how are we being supported, achieve or actualize our rights? So having like a foundation that sort of ties how we do our advocacy in the different ways that we want to identify, but then there's a common vision that we are working towards, that we are all in agreement about, for example, being supported to live within our communities and not within institutions. You know, however way that I want to identify, that I'm being supported to work, you know, to receive healthcare that's quality, to have friends. So I think that the different diversities, the different choices that there are, and however I would wish to add and can act as a pillar really to solidify our movement and make our voices stronger, you know, as we agitate or for the advancement of our rights in the diversities that are there. Yeah.
I think that's a really great point too. I think it kind of lends back to what Bagavi was saying too about abolition versus reform. Like, you know, despite identifying certain ways, we can all work towards a common goal or common goals. Fady or Chloe, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I don't want to skip ahead too much, but I think that there is like a really like interesting conversation to be had around how like especially a generational conversation about how there's a greater willingness and openness to talk about mental health over the last decade, but how that can be or cannot be beneficial for certain subgroups within the movement. I think that there's, you know, a normalization of mental health as being part of our common discourse, but I've often wondered or worried that we're forgetting about a lot of what's brought up in this panel. We're forgetting about the human rights struggles. We're not centering the voices of the people that are most marginalized and oppressed, and we're not talking about the violence of psychiatry and how it's not experienced the same way by everyone. So I think that there's a really important conversation to be had there, because I think there's a lot of knowledge that's being lost between, you know, the generations before us and the current generation or the current movement, and the discourse that's being led largely by kind of large, sometimes corporatized mental health campaigns, and what is or is not allowed or permitted in that space.
Absolutely. Fady, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what both Liz and Chloe have said, and I think, you know, policy diversity complicates policy. Like, policy is not really a place for complications, right? I think why we really need to like understand diversity, why we really need to understand like that multiple identities exist in our movement, that they complicate things, is essential for our activism, like as we consider and make demands, right? That we aren't making demands, I think, like Chloe and Liz said, that, you know, end up throwing members of our community, those who are the most peripheral, under the bus, right? That we don't ask for something to be, you know, sort of codified or put into reform or policy that end up actually perpetuating harm on certain groups. So that's where I think the sort of diversity piece, the multiple identity piece, is essential.
Yeah, I'm already hearing too a lot about resisting kind of the medical or health system paradigm here. Does anyone want to talk about maybe how to engage other stakeholders besides medical or health systems, and how to like shift advocacy away from that? Maybe again, we start with you, Liz, if that's okay.
Sure. And I think going back to what Bhagavi said, so if you're looking at what is the entry, so if the entry is mental health or the entry is inclusion, and I think that's what I see as a CRPD. I see that is what I was offered. So for example, within the disability movement, at least in my country, there's sometimes we are asked, you know, are you people with disabilities? Like, you have to prove your disability. And we're thrown to the healthcare system. But then we are saying that we are not perpetual patients, that all that we need is just know the right to healthcare. So we are looking at all other rights. We're looking at, you know, all that I mentioned: employment, family, healthcare is important, social protection. So we are looking at which way leads us to this broader context, you know, to speak with other stakeholders. So that, for example, if we have a stakeholder meeting as the peer initiative that we mentioned, championing for inclusive communities, we're just not calling the Ministry of Health, but we are calling the Ministry of Education, we are calling the Ministry, social protection. So, and I see that as really important, that opening up our experiences to also consider, you know, many other aspects, because we're just not one story, we're just not about accessing just healthcare, very important, but to also recognize that how do we equally access these other rights? Because, for example, because I couldn't keep a job, I was always dependent, you know, on family. Or we did a survey in our peer support group, and we noted that a large number, you know, had informal business, informal work, or you're working in your family business, which might not necessarily have security as we may imagine, maybe insurance. And so I think to live really this wholesome, broad life, that is why I feel that we have to consider much more than just access to health and just health stakeholders. I hope this is sort of trying to respond to this question.
I think that was a really great response. Thank you. Chloe or Fady, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree as well. Like, we need to look at barriers across society, and that I think one is often ignored is education as well, like post-secondary education, and ensuring accommodations and supports are available throughout that process. Having worked in kind of both the post-secondary spaces, but also workplace accommodations, disability management, I've seen that at least, you know, in the spaces that I've worked in, at least there's an acknowledgement of the legal duty to accommodate in the workplace more so than there is in post-secondary environments. I think it's, you know, anyway, so I think understanding the obligations, like the binding legal obligations that exist on institutions to provide accommodations and supports to all people with disabilities, which includes, you know, mental health or psychosocial disabilities, is a really critical step forward. And, you know, this also feeds into kind of the larger discourse and how, for some reason, people with mental health or psychosocial disabilities are not being talked about or not discussed in a larger space about, you know, in a disability context, in a human rights context, in the context of being discriminated against in the workplace. I think that's often left out of mainstream discourse and at the detriment of the rights of these groups.
Absolutely. Fady, do you have anything to add before we move on? So we're going to move into our next theme area, which is psychiatry and biomedicalism as colonial tools. So our first question here is, some leaders of our movement have linked biomedicalism, psychiatry, and colonialism. Would you consider this linkage as important to your work? And maybe this time we'll start with Fady.
Thanks, Livia. Yeah, I think this question is really important, and I think it's this connection that scholars and activists have made is essential for my work and the work of many scholars and activists in both the global North and the global South. You know, in Turtle Island, the region now called North America, and part of that is Canada, scholars have tied together the disproportionate experiences of distress and suicidality among Indigenous people, and ongoing historical, and ongoing forms of colonial violence. So those things have been tied together. Scholars like Dr. Lynn Lavelle and Dr. Jennifer Poole, you know, they in an article, they talk about the Anishinaabeg teachings, that these violences impact 7 generations, right? They do not just impact the current one, but they in fact, trauma is passed on, right, through these generations. Those that have experienced by ancestors don't get washed away, right? They get passed along. And so colonial violence in Canada continues in so many ways. One example is the state's reluctance to deeply engage in calls for reconciliation, to acknowledge the violence of residential schools. We've taken Indigenous folks to court, right, in this country over these matters. You know, the fact that Indigenous children are still the highest children in state care. The 60s and millennials group is still having ongoing impact. And like one person just said, Jessica, in the chat, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. On the international scale, I look to the work of Dr. China Mills and Dr. Suman Fernando, who have called attention to the harms of global mental health initiatives that export Western knowledge or Western psychiatry, Western notions of well-being and care over and above traditional and local approaches. You know, they refer to this as psychiatric imperialism, and I think it's sort of a helpful concept when describing why this exporting of psychiatry is so harmful. You know, they talk about it as an extension of just old empires. And I think that's sort of a really helpful way of describing, you know, what it is, what we're doing, right, when we're asking for the expansion of mental health in global South countries, as if it's working for us here, right, in the global North, to then think of exporting it. I also think that we talked about climate change a little bit before, and I think pollution as colonialism is a really helpful concept. This is from Dr. Kristen Boss, who talks about that, climate change is an extension of empires in so many ways that causes violence, from forced migration to, e-waste in Nigeria that causes bioaccumulation of heavy metals in children that creates biological and psychic effects. So, and just for my research, this is sort of a large scale conversation, but just for my little approach to think about international students and sort of the violence that happens to international students through a process of naturalization, right? When we sort of recruit students to come to global North countries, and in the process of that recruitment, sort of naturalize them to become Western, and somehow don't consider how that is going to be causing distress, right? When you're constantly being told and nudged in many different ways, right, that you're not meeting the mark. When you're told that the language that you're using, English, is not to the level that it should be. When you're reading materials, right, by often old dead French white guys that don't represent, right, your experiences, that aren't reflective of your ideas. And so, just as sort of like a micro example, right, of how colonialism still continues to affect us in many different ways in many different communities.
All really great. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. Chloe or Liz, do you have anything you want to add?
I think for me, the discussion around colonialism, I think I would have to mention, issues around laws and the constitutions, that we adapted from, colonial powers, laws that actually take away the personhood of people, laws where we have penal courts that have language that is really dehumanizing, when you have a law that calls someone an imbecile, when you have laws that speak to, persons of unsound mind, laws that actually are stripping people away of their dignity and that started years ago, that still continues, in laws that are made in countries. And when you have laws that do that, then it also comes down to practice, at community level, where people are disrespected, where there are broad pictures of who, a mad person looks like. A mad person is a non-person, and the law says that. The law says that you cannot marry if you're of unsound mind, that there can be a divorce if you're a person of unsound mind. And, I see that as the violence, as the trauma that was brought about by colonialism, that is still taking all these years to undo. And it takes time, it takes time looking at mental asylums, where people who questioned authority then, were put aside. And now the history of asylums in our own countries, being looked at as places where you discard people and leave them for years, with no contact to community. So I see this as what colonialism did, that we need to know, that we need to talk more about, and see that how do young activists, within the movement, how do we work to actually sort of address these years of violation that came about because of colonialism.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah. Chloe, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think it was really covered. Yeah, especially like just kind of the connection between, our broader social context or connection to the environment, like all these things that are part of the colonial legacy that also have a psychosocial impact as well.
So kind of going off of this, how do we resist kind of co-optation by global mental health movements, as was kind of brought up earlier, so that local realities and traditional ways of healing aren't displaced or are maybe less displaced. Fadi, do you want to start?
Yeah, I stared at this question for a while, trying to think of an answer to this, and I think it's a really hard question, and I welcome like input, of course, from the other panelists and also people in the audience who might have an answer to this question that maybe I haven't thought about. But co-opting forces are always a possibility. You know, they're the territorializing force of things like psychiatric imperialism is never slowed down. And so, you know, in Ontario, for example, the largest mental health institution, the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH, has a dedicated wing now for Indigenous health justice and wellness called Sakabe Makwa. This is an Indigenous-run healing space within the largest psychiatric hospital in Canada. And that centers Indigenous healing in addressing trauma and violence. And this is undoubtedly something to celebrate. But as one scholar asks, who does work on this, is reconciliation possible through this space? And my question is like, how can healing start if there's no acknowledgement of from CAMH and from institutions like this, right, of psychiatry's role in the construction of Indigenous people as biologically and psychically inferior, right? Psychiatry hasn't done that work. It hasn't revealed itself, right, as part of the colonial violence. I wonder where CAMH and other institutions co-opting Indigenous or other traditional healing practices, where they land on the issue of land rematriation, right? I mean, CAMH is on stolen land. And so it's interesting to have a building, right, sitting on that stolen land, right, that's specifically meant to respond to the effects of that theft. I think in addition to being concerned about traditional healing practices being displaced, I also think we need to be really concerned with them being classified as an extension of the Psy industries, right? I think we're going to start seeing sort of, this is happening with the concept of wellness. Like wellness is now so much a part of Psy industries that even self-care practices, which should at least had, in some ways could have been resistive, right, are no longer that, right? They have lost all of they are now just neoliberalized forms of care. And so I think we have to be wary of when they're brought into the fold of psychiatry without any other critical work being done. And I think this is where Bulgari's term of like abolitionist and reform that we're talking about before rubs up against each other, right? Yeah.
Great points. Thank you so much. Liz, Chloe, do you have something you want to add?
Yeah, I just kind of building off of that. I mean, I think that there is a lot of grassroots work and communities that are either already pushing back and resisting or creating alternatives or, supports outside of the medicalized system, or keen to do so if they were given the right support. And I think the examples that I've seen in my work that have been the most successful is when there's people within who have power within institutions, whether it be academia, whether it be medical institutions, who are genuinely, push back against the dominant response and support this kind of work that's being done and led by communities. And I think that's a difficult thing to do well because it involves sort of a very deep decolonization process. It involves those people who are, like I said, in positions of power, relinquishing that power and giving it to people in communities to actually drive and dictate, the parameters of the work and how it should be done. But those are the examples that I've seen that have been the most successful. And I think also, the potential for that process to also help counter biomedicalism in Western society more broadly by engaging in these decolonization processes, by supporting things like peer support or, cultural practices that are healing practices that help, heal from the intergenerational traumas of colonialism. Those types of initiatives, I think is what we need to do. But, as Fadi said, there's always the potential for co-optation, and it's an ongoing process of trying to resist that and prevent it. It's not just from the onset, it has to be like deliberately and consciously thought of throughout on an ongoing basis.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Absolutely. Liz, do you have anything you want to add?
I think just briefly, just as my peer said, just recognizing the traditional practices of healing. And I think supporting communities to document this practice. So that we and others then can learn that what did communities do, what do traditional healers do, for example, in our context, but also looking at, the communal way of living that is also being disrupted, and there being now more individualistic ways of living, but then to see how do we support communities really to embrace these traditional ways. But maybe, I don't know if that also fits here, but also to recognize that sometimes there could be violations in some practices that happen, in traditional ways, just to be cognizant of that and see that how do we support that healing is, again, not traumatic or traumatizing to people.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay, I'll just ask one more quick question in this section and then we'll move on, because I think it kind of shifts well into our next section. But it was noted that a lot of young people, maybe even at times uncritically, are taking up psychiatric labeling and mental illness identities. What do you think accounts for this trend, and how do we educate youth about psychiatry? Fadi, do you want to start again?
Yeah, I just want to note Lucy's comment in the chat as well. I think it's like a really important to acknowledge that Sakabi Mekwe was lobbied for and by Indigenous people, which is, I think, why it's sort of a challenging example, but I think one that brings to fore sort of the complexity of these issues being, part of psychiatry, not part of psychiatry, etc. So my observations are limited to the global north and university settings. And so, I spend a lot of time speaking with young people on different topics. And I think what youth are doing with psychiatric labeling is really fascinating. I think they're engaging in an element of play. That's really interesting. They understand that a label is necessary for access to services and supports, but they're critical of that fact, and also of what they get when they get the label, right? That support is often not really very helpful. But they comprehend that their distress isn't just biomedical or psychosocial, but a consequence of living in a world that is literally on fire. They're dealing with climate change and precarious housing and employment markets and the potential outbreak of another world war. Like we went from one day potentially going into World War III, and the next day, no, it was fine. Poland was an accident. Like that's a considerable amount of stress, right, on a young person, on all of us. Psychiatry offers an explanation for how they're feeling, but for many, even these explanations, I think, fall short. So their willingness to take on psychiatric labels is a means to an end, even if they know that those supports are limited. And I think there's a contradiction there that's actually really interesting and one that could be further studied.
Totally. I absolutely agree. I think it's a very interesting topic. Chloe or Liz, do you want to add anything quickly before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think you described it wonderfully and better than I could. Really kind of like hit the nail on the head with how I think young people see those labels. Can just describe from my own experience that I feel like what's missing is the education around the human rights framework and understanding of it. Because I think I always felt, like you said, that there was something missing from this medical model, that there was an injustice that was happening, but I didn't always have the language or the framework to articulate that within. And there wasn't mentors or resources for me to bring me into that kind of way of understanding or growing with that understanding. Yeah, and the other thing I think of is, what types of labels are being taken up in what kind of spaces. I still think that there is, we talk about the stigmatization of mental health or psychiatric labeling. I think that's a misnomer. I think we should call it discrimination, because that's what it is. But I also think about the fact that certain types of psychiatric labels have become normalized and such that they can be disclosed more comfortably, in workspaces or in social spaces or even publicly on social media. But other types of psychiatric labels are still highly stigmatized or discriminated against. And I wonder if that kind of, the campaigns around mental health awareness, if those campaigns are really, again, helping the people that are most marginalized in our community. And I worry that they're not actually, that they're not accomplishing that. I think there's, and I don't see that changing within the context of these very corporatized campaigns.
Absolutely, for sure. Liz, do you have anything you want to add quickly?
I just really agreeing with what Chloe is saying, especially about the labeling. And because then there's less priority on what supports are we going to offer people who have these labels. So that then there's more emphasis that instead of the labels, whatever label it is, because there are some labels that bring with them a picture of someone that really needs very, very high needs, and someone maybe needs mild support, which shouldn't be the case, which should be what supports are we offering to people, so that people don't feel isolated, people feel supported, and people feel that if they need to disclose whatever label, then whatever identity they have, they still feel safe, that they'll be able to receive support that they may require at any given point.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you so much. So we're just going to move on to our final theme here, which is movement building. So our question first is, where do you think our movement / activism is currently headed, and where would you like to take it? And I'll ask Chloe to start with this one, if that's okay.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think I've spoken to this a little bit already, in terms of the fact that I think our current state, at least, again, in the North American context in which, and where I am, I think that the movement is, unfortunately right now, really being driven by these kinds of corporatized wellness campaigns. Like, I'm thinking the Bell Let's Talk campaign, which, I mean, has shifted the dialogue, and there may be some positive aspects of it, but I think it's also largely co-opted the discourse. And I think we need to think about where we go from here and what how do we reclaim that? I think that there is, there's something that was said in the earlier panel. I don't know if it was who said it, if it was Bargavi or Lucy, but this idea of we talk about individuals rather than collectives now. And I think that's missing. And I think we're missing the kind of movement building, collective knowledge sharing aspect to it. And we're definitely missing, a kind of social or human rights framework, I guess, beyond kind of these spaces like this. I think in the larger discourse, it's missing. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more I could say. Yeah, and you know, how do we recognize that there, you know, a lot of people, a high percentage of the population for various socioeconomic reasons is struggling with their psychological well-being right now. How do we recognize that and support all of our psychological well-being so that we can all thrive, while also recognizing that there's individuals within our population that have additional barriers and require additional accommodations or supports, or, you know, face more discrimination than others. I think that's another conversation that we need to be having, about ensuring that we're not leaving behind people. And that's really what I've seen in terms of how it's evolved, in terms of, you know, more and more people are feeling comfortable seeking access to supports. And that's a good thing. But I worry about individuals who are, you know, are being left behind throughout all of this.
Absolutely. Fady or Liz, do you want to add something?
I think what I would wish to add around movements is also to acknowledge, I think, the role that the International Disability Alliance has played over time, especially to build, to strengthen our capacities as persons with psychosocial disabilities, to advocate from the frameworks, you know, human rights-based frameworks, the CRPD, you know, looking at the SDGs, and sort of supporting us to also claim a space within the disability movement, because we still remain underrepresented within the disability movement. And so once we have this strength, you know, to be able to advocate, and it also gives us confidence, you know, to walk into rooms and be unafraid to still stay there, you know, when they tell us that, you don't fit this, but then we are able to really claim our space by the frameworks that are in existence, and also to recognize then that we still have so much to do from like rural areas, you know, people who have less and less support, less access to services, social support within communities, exclusion. So recognizing that, but also then appreciating that now more and more we are really building solidarities among movements, and, you know, just appreciating the role of TCI, you know, even supporting peers, even as to start, you know, peer-led initiatives, which in itself, you know, speaks to the steps that are being made to claim more voice and, you know, realize the possibility, realize that we can live within communities with the supports that we require.
Absolutely. Thank you. Fady, do you want to add something? Okay, so I'll ask another question from this section. I think kind of going off what you were saying, Liz, how can we, or the cross-disability movement more generally, support, embrace, and represent psychosocial disabilities better or at all in some cases? Chloe, do you want to start?
Actually, I wouldn't mind if someone else started.
Liz, do you maybe want to expand on what you were saying?
Yeah, because I want to give an example, you know, where we were in a meeting, cross disability, this happens, and a leader says that there are people that should be made decisions for. There are people that should be sterilized. There are people, when not in their right senses or when they don't have mental capacity, decisions should be made for them. So that's someone who was speaking on a table where they were sitting with someone with a psychosocial disability and someone with an intellectual disability. And it really hit me hard, you know, that maybe there's more that we need to do within the cross-disability sector, you know, because if you're in a space where someone from the movement actually feels or says that some groups of people actually can have their rights stripped of them and not feel bad about it. So I think there's still more that needs to be done, but I feel that it shouldn't just be us as with social disabilities always pushing for this recognition, but that then more, and I don't know what, or have, of course it's already happening, but that we can have more allies speaking to our issues, more allies saying that, you know, we are persons, you know, don't strip people of their rights just because they have this impairment. Yeah, so I thought to share that there's still more work that needs to be done to really bring our awareness to the cross-disability movement, but already it's starting really to appreciate that there's much more good work happening, but there's still other harm that is likely to be done if we really don't speak about our issue.
Absolutely. I think allyship is a really important part of this conversation, especially like within movements. Chloe or Fady, do you have something you want to add?
I mean, I just want to thank Elizabeth for that example, because I just think it really hits home like what we're talking about here. And you know, I can't imagine like what it was like to sit in that room and sort of have that happening, and then having to sort of be calm, right, and explain to the person doing all of that sort of emotional labor of like, you know, trying to explain to them why we shouldn't do that, right? Why like capacity shouldn't be brought into the conversation. And I mean, for me, I think you know, the work that I do is informed by disability justice, right? Is informed by the 10 principles of disability justice that were created by Black, Indigenous, people of color, disabled, queer scholars and activists in the US, in California, who sort of gave us this playbook, right, about how to do cross-movement solidarity work, you know, thinking about interdependence and collective action and collective access, collective liberation, all of these sorts of ways of doing it that I think are sort of really helpful to think through any sort of demand or action, right? We're not thinking of asylums alone. We're thinking of asylums and prisons and kids in cages and et cetera, when we're thinking about these complex issues, right? That they're multifaceted and they affect many communities differently. But I think like Elizabeth's example is one that sort of demonstrates where some people are at, right, in the community when it comes to, you know, who's deserving of care and who is not. Yeah.
Absolutely. Chloe, do you have anything you want to add just about movement building in general before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I you know, kind of what came to mind is that I think that there is still sometimes a debate even about whether psychosocial disabilities are part of the cross-disability movement for some reason. I mean, I had an experience when I was working in my student union on a policy on accessibility, you know, kind of raising the point that the policy didn't talk about mental health and was told kind of, oh, that's a different policy, that doesn't, you know, that's not what this one is about kind of thing. So I think that's still contested. And certainly there are differences, and you don't want to, in being inclusive and having the grace to ignore those nuances and those differences, you know, the diversity of experiences and diversity of barriers. But yeah, I think it's still definitely not fully understood, or those connections are need to be reformed and strengthened.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And with that, we've reached the end of our panel. So I want to thank all the panelists again. This was such an interesting discussion. I'm so happy that I was able to be here. And now we're just going to move into our Q&A portion. So we'll be taking some questions from the audience. There's some here already, but if you have any more, please put them in the Q&A and we will try to answer them.
And Olivia, first, I just want to thank you guys for just a fantastic discussion and panel. So many rich things that you've shared, and certainly a lot of comments in the chat. I just also want to alert you, Olivia, that Abe's been gathering up some of the questions from the chat, so I have some of those that I can contribute as well. So I think we'll start with the ones that have been written, and then if we have time, we can open it up to people directly. So you can go ahead, Olivia, and ask some of the ones from the Q&A first.
Okay.
Marina, it might be actually easier for you because I've literally listed it out and I've moved a bunch of them out of the Q&A. So if you want, it might be easier than passing it to Olivia.
Okay, perfect. All right. So, I mean, there's lots of, I think, themes that have been pulled together both in the chat and in the Q&A box. So, one of the questions that I will sort of pose, I guess, to the panelists, but also to our previous speakers. So someone asked, I read an email which suggests that people who find themselves in Toronto, Canada, also holding a mental health diagnosis, may successfully request euthanasia from health professionals there. Does this statement hold any truth in fact? So wondering if anybody wants to speak to that. I don't know if Lucy, you might, or Chloe.
Yeah, Lucy, if you want to go ahead. I recently wrote about this, so I have I can explain maybe the legal context, and then if you want to add on. So to back up, medical assistance in dying has been available in Canada for since 2015. There was recently a decision to remove one of the requirements that people need to be at end of life, and that essentially means that people with psychosocial disabilities or mental health diagnoses would be eligible. And in light of anyway, there's a temporary prohibition until 2023, but as of next year, people with, whatever label you want to say, psychosocial disabilities or mental health diagnoses will be able to request medical assistance in dying. That doesn't mean that everyone who requests it will get access to it, but there's a lot of open questions about how and on what basis access should be granted or denied, who should be making those decisions, how do you respect the autonomy of people in that situation, but also recognize, the broader socioeconomic context that drive people to make that decision. It's a very complex conversation. I don't know if we have time to really fully do it justice in this situation, but I guess the short answer is there is some truth to that statement.
Thanks, Chloe. Bhargavi, did you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you, Marina. It's been a most fascinating discussion today. Thank you so much for this. During the discussions that we participated in as TCI with respect to the made law and the proposed amendments, it came across as a legal curiosity that countries which have made a reservation on Article 12 and therefore deny personhood and decision-making powers to persons with psychosocial disabilities would actually now make it convenient for persons with psychosocial disabilities to choose to end their lives. So this is for me, one of the whole colonial kind of bizarre situations that we get entangled in. And so unless, of course, the solution is that unless Canada and other countries which have reserved Article 12 remove that reservation and make it possible for persons with psychosocial disabilities to have capacity to decide, the option of seeking MAID scheme would be, it would be like really a very huge legal curiosity and unconscionable aspect of using this colonial law to further subjugate. So this is my view. Of course, I am not Canadian and I'm not involved with these laws, but it's bizarre. And I see so much of such bizarre things happening in my country and other countries as well, where these, colonial shackling exists.
Thanks, Bhargavi. Any other comments on that one?
I'll just add that I do think the legislation is bringing forward existential questions about capacity assessment, because ultimately, access to MAID will be based on assessment of capacity. And I think that with also the criteria that access be granted to people who have a grievous and irremediable illness, also brings into question a tussle between the notion that we have to wait for science to prove that a mental health issue is irremediable and grievous versus the capacity questions. So I think all of this is bogging down how this piece of legislation is unfolding specifically for psychiatric disability. And I really want to disentangle that from the history of other disability movements, because I think the two are getting conflated. And I think it's really complex. And it's important to understand that there have been quite a number of debates, and also that people who have psychiatric disability some have spoken, but there hasn't been enough conversation across the country, specifically fostering opportunities for discussion about this. And so I think we have to just still listen to what people with psychiatric disabilities are saying about this, and also, quite frankly, have conversations about how we deal with palliative care for people with psychiatric disabilities. And people may not be getting access to MAID currently, or may not be able to get access to MAID in the future, but absolutely, without a doubt, there are people who've been in the system for years and years and years, and the way that they're dealt with is by given copious amounts of treatments, interventions, year after year after year after year. And I think this is one of the complex questions that we have to take up in the service user community. Like, people who don't have advocates, are in community mental health care, who have tried every single thing, have been banned from different agencies, and are now being managed by just giving copious amounts of interventions. What do we do about that? Or how do we feel about that? I do think it's a large conversation that we can't necessarily get into here.
Yeah, no, thank you for those insights. I think they're really important. There's been sort of a set of questions that I think are related to this. If we sort of think about movements and activism, a set of questions around sort of where does madness and psychosocial disability fit within disability movements more broadly? So some comments about how historically, there hasn't been a very good recognition within disability activism of saneism, of discrimination, then the very specific experiences of people with psychosocial disabilities. So I just wondered if any of you wanted to comment on that piece.
So, may I, Marina?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so for us in the global south, I think this is true for many of the countries, particularly in the Asia Pacific region. Because there is no strong user survivor movement or MAD movement as such. And also we were fortunate to receive large parts of Asia Pacific. We were fortunate to receive the CRPD without reservations, quite almost as soon as the CRPD was ratified. I think so. We had certain conducive historical circumstances which made it possible for us to integrate more easily into the disability movement. For example, in countries like Nepal, which didn't have mental health laws, mental institutions, there was a broader value base of disability inclusion, and we were able to kind of integrate ourselves into the disability movement way easier than it possibly is for some other countries where the user survivor voice has been strong over the years, and the mental health laws have set up like really strong barriers for looking. I always say that the mental health law is like Medusa. You can't look away, and we get caught in the polemics. Whereas for us, that does not exist in many parts of our regions. And so we can look at, like Liz was saying, look at education, we can look at employment, we can participate in many of the disability policy discussions, and be included in disability laws. Even for India, from 1995, we've been part of the disability legislation. So it has been quite a different experience for us in many parts of the global South.
Thanks, Bhargavi. Does anybody else want to comment on that one? Maybe I'll ask one more question from I know our time is getting short, but one more question from that somebody put up. And this was a question related to this sort of discussion about abolitionism versus reform, and whether or not, again, sort of appreciating that we shouldn't be thinking about these as sort of polar opposites. But the question was around, there might be very different strategies that would be engaged for each of these. So just wondered if any of the panelists had some thoughts about that tension and how people can move their energies towards one or the other. Lucy, did you want to?
Yeah, I think, I can't remember the phrase the person used, but they talked about transitional abolition. But I think that these conversations about abolition also happen in particular sites with particular tenets of privilege, because abolition is not an option for people who are seeking supports and who have nobody, and don't engage in that conversation. And I'm not saying that we don't strive for abolition. I'm just saying it's a very abolition discourse happens in particular spaces and it doesn't happen in other spaces. Having said that, I think Liz talked about the need for solidarity across different movements, because we don't have like a heterogeneous movement, a homogeneous movement, and we're not all doing the same things, and that's been very clear, that there are different needs in different jurisdictions and different kinds of work happening. So I like this idea that about like figuring out like spaces and practices where we can come to some consensus. And I think there are spaces that we can figure that out, because when I started like talking this morning, I did reflect a lot about how we are still here. We are unyielding and we are not extinguishable. And that to me is quite profound, given the forces that are constantly trying to erase and destroy people. So for me, it's like the work of doing more solidarity building, probably moving a little bit away from identity politics, because identity politics have I think, complicated like social movement work. So working across solidarity goals to get to a place where we do even work towards the simple goal of minimizing coercion across different jurisdictions. Is that achievable? Can we do that and strive towards that?
Right. Thank you, Lucy, for that. So sadly, we've come to we're getting very close to the end of our time. So Bhargavi, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah. Well, I just had to give a counter perspective to what Lucy is saying on abolitionism. I'm so sorry. I come from a context where communities are, we do see the point in searching out community spaces where we all belong. And with respect to the guidelines on deinstitutionalization, which is a big thing within the United Nations today, I think the basic minimum is not is no more violence upon us, no more violence upon us. And I think that in a sense is abolitionist, and we know that violence happens both in the community as well as in institutions. And so, yeah, I think that that's something that must immediately stop. And we would agree with this when it comes to violence against women, for example, or violence against Indigenous people. I mean, there is no way we would condone this. And so let's limit the gender-based violence. We wouldn't say that. And so, by the same standards, I think that just has to stop. Whatever policy measures we take, but violence against us must stop. We must be recognized as persons first. And I think that's a fair demand to make upon anybody.
Thank you for that, Garvey. Maybe that's a very maybe that's a point we can end on. I mean, I think this is a conversation that has to be ongoing. I feel like there's so much more to be said on all of the things that we've been that have been raised today. But I wanted to take the time just to thank our speakers, Garvey and Lucy and Olivia, and all of our panelists, Fady, Chloe, and Liz, for sharing such important insights and raising so many important issues that we can continue to think about for a long time, I think. I also want to thank a few other people who have been very important in this process and who've been a little bit in the background today, but have been running things. So I want to thank Risha Sharma, Abe Joseph, Susan Hardy, Mokar Puri, for all of your important contributions and support to put this webinar on. And also our fantastic interpreters and Spanish translators. Thank you so much for being part of this and for supporting folks. We are going to, luckily the conversation can continue. So just to remind you, this has been recorded. People who have signed up for this webinar will get the recording and the chat. We also have planned 2 more webinars. The dates are to be released, but they are focused on disrupting biomedical reductionism in mental health, enhancing equity and protecting human rights. And then a third one on building back better socially just mental health care. So please follow us on our websites via Twitter and Instagram to learn about the upcoming webinars so that you can sign up and stay in touch. And I know that some of you have put your emails and various things in the chat, and we'll endeavor to get in touch with you after the webinar. So thank you again to everyone, and particularly thanks to the participants. We've had great participation, lots of really insightful things shared in the chat and in the questions. So wishing everyone a good morning, afternoon, and evening, depending on where you're coming in from.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.